She came to Blackwood Manor with a single trunk, a borrowed veil, and the desperate hope that marriage to a duke would be better than the life she was escaping. She was wrong, but not in the way she expected. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you discovered that the woman everyone said was dead was actually living in the attic above your bedroom, what would you do? Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you become exactly what they were trying to make you? Silent, compliant, and slowly erased? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because tonight's story is about a young duchess who was handed a set of keys to her new home with one key deliberately missing. And what she found when she finally got that key will change everything you think you know about this marriage, this manor, and the woman they called a ghost. Subscribe and hit the bell before we begin, because this story has a twist in the middle that nobody sees coming. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your country. Let me know who is in the room with us. Now, let's go to Blackwood. The wedding was beautiful. That was the thing Serafina would remember later, in the dark, when beautiful things had begun to frighten her. The flowers had been white roses, hundreds of them, filling the chapel with a scent so heavy it sat on the chest like a hand. The guests had murmured admiringly as she walked the aisle. The Duke had watched her come toward him with an expression she had read as tenderness and would later learn to read differently. She was 22. She had been living under the guardianship of her father's brother for 4 years since her parents died, and those 4 years had been sufficient to teach her that survival sometimes required accepting terms you had not chosen. When Duke Alistair Blackwood had appeared in her uncle's drawing room 6 weeks earlier, dark-haired, quietly spoken, with the contained authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice, she had assessed the situation with the practical clarity of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly. He was 35. He was wealthy. He was a widower, his first wife dead of fever 2 years prior. He was looking for a suitable second duchess, and her uncle, who had never found her anything but inconvenient, was looking for a suitable disposal. Serafina had said yes. She was not naive enough to call it love. She was hopeful enough to call it possibility. And she was clear-eyed enough to understand that possibility, for a woman in her position, was not something to refuse. What she could not have known, what no one had thought to tell her, or had been paid not to tell her, was that Blackwood Manor kept its secrets the way old houses keep cold. In the walls, in the foundations, in the rooms that stayed locked regardless of season. She would learn this on the day she arrived. Blackwood Manor rose from the Devonshire moors like something that had always been there and had simply allowed a house to be built around it. It was enormous and grey and beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful, precisely because they contain something that should not be looked at directly. The drive wound through grounds that were impeccably maintained. Topiary, gravel, roses trained along stone walls with the precision of things that had been controlled for generations. Serafina sat forward in the carriage and looked at it and felt, for the first time since the wedding, the specific chill of a decision she could not unmake. Alistair was beside her. He had been pleasant throughout the journey. Attentive in the measured way she was learning was his primary mode, asking after her comfort, pointing out landmarks with brief, precise descriptions. He was not warm, exactly. He was careful. She had decided to read this as consideration rather than distance. She was still deciding. "The West Wing," he said, as the carriage rounded the final curve and the full face of the manor came into view, "is not in use. You will have the run of the rest of the house, of course, but the West Wing is kept closed. I trust that won't be an inconvenience." It was phrased as a question, but it was not a question. "Of course not," Serafina said. He nodded, as though she had confirmed something. She noted the nod and filed it away with the other small things she was filing. The way he had redirected her when she asked about his first wife. The way certain subjects seemed to reach an invisible wall in conversation and stop there. She was building a picture. She had learned to build pictures from incomplete information. 4 years under her uncle's roof had taught her that the things people did not say were frequently more useful than the things they did. The carriage stopped. A line of servants waited on the front steps with the rigid precision of people who had been arranged rather than gathered. And at the top of the steps, framed by the manor's stone arch, with the particular stillness of someone who had been standing there for some time and intended for that to be noticed, was Lady Morgana Blackwood. She was perhaps 60, though she carried her age like an accessory rather than a condition. Her hair was white and immaculate. Her dress was black, which Serafina would later understand was not mourning, but preference. She was handsome in the way that authority sometimes makes people handsome. The features sharp with a lifetime of certainty. She looked at Serafina the way a person looks at something they have already assessed and whose assessment they consider complete. "My dear," she said, as Serafina reached the top of the steps. "Welcome to Blackwood." Her tone was warm. Her eyes were not. "Lady Morgana?" Serafina met her gaze directly. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." Something moved in Morgana's expression. Surprise, quickly replaced. She had expected, Serafina thought, someone easier to read, someone who would drop their eyes. "Come inside," Morgana said. "There is a great deal to learn." The housekeeper's tour of Blackwood Manor took 2 hours. The manor was vast. East wing, central hall, library, music room, conservatory, kitchens below, family quarters above. Serafina paid attention to everything. She was good at attention. She noted which servants looked at her and which looked away. She noted which rooms had the particular stillness of spaces that were cleaned regularly, but not lived in. She noted which doors were locked and where in the manor they were located. The west wing entrance was in the central hall, a pair of double doors in dark oak, locked, with no key visible in the lock. She noted this without pausing in her stride. The attic stairs were at the far end of the east corridor, a narrow door, also locked, also without a visible key. She noted this as well. That evening, Morgana presented her with a ring of household keys. The ceremony of it was elaborate. The old ring placed in Serafina's hands with the gravity of a formal transfer of authority. Morgana's expression during the presentation was the expression of someone performing generosity they do not feel. "The keys to the house," Morgana said. "As is traditional." Serafina counted them. She had already counted the locks she had observed. The numbers did not match. "There seems to be one missing," she said pleasantly. Morgana's smile did not waver. The attic, the late Duchess, Alistair's first wife, it was her private space. When she passed, we sealed it as a mark of respect. It has not been opened since. A pause, loaded with careful weight. "It would be improper to disturb it. I'm certain you understand." "Of course," Serafina said, in the tone she had developed for agreeing to things she did not agree to. She turned the keyring over in her hands. What was she like? The first Duchess? Something shifted in Morgana's face, too quick to catch fully, but present. "Delicate," she said. Elena was a very delicate woman. The fever took her quickly. It was a mercy, in the end. She was not suited to the demands of Blackwood. She looked at Serafina as she said it. The assessment in her gaze was direct and deliberate. "Let's see if you understand what I'm telling you." Serafina looked back at her pleasantly. She understood exactly what was being told. She simply chose not to show it. She found the embroidery on the 4th morning. She had taken to walking the grounds in the early light, partly because she liked the moors in that quiet hour, and partly because the inside of the manor had a quality she was still calibrating, the sense of a house holding its breath. The garden behind the east wing was walled and overgrown in the specific way of spaces that had been someone's passion and had been abandoned. There were climbing roses along the south wall, unpruned, and a stone bench half hidden by ornamental grass gone wild. The embroidery was caught on the rose thorns at the base of the south wall. A piece of fine white linen, no larger than a handkerchief, worked in a pattern of silver thread, a pattern of interlocking vines and small birds that she recognized with a cold, specific jolt in her chest. The pattern was identical to the embroidery on her wedding veil. She stood very still, holding it. The morning air moved across the moors, and the rose thorns held the linen with the delicacy of something that had not been there long. The silver thread caught the low light. There was a stain on one corner. She looked at it carefully. Dark, reddish-brown, dried, but not old. Days at most. She looked up at the manor, at the east wing, at the windows above the east wing, at the top window, the one that corresponded to where the attic stairs were located. Something moved. A pale shape. There and then gone. There and then gone. Serafina folded the embroidery and put it carefully in her pocket and walked back inside. She did not tell Alistair that day. She was still constructing the picture, and she had learned that releasing incomplete pictures was dangerous. Instead, she watched. She watched the servants, specifically which ones cleaned the attic corridor, and whether anyone delivered anything to the locked attic door. She watched Morgana, specifically the pattern of her movements in the early morning before the household fully woke. On the 5th morning she saw it. Morgana, at 6 o'clock, moving through the east corridor with a covered tray and a set of keys at her belt. Moving with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this many times. Moving toward the attic door. Serafina watched from the shadow of the corridor junction and did not breathe until Morgana had gone through the door and closed it behind her. Someone was in the attic. Someone who was being brought food before the household woke. Someone whose existence was being managed by Morgana alone. Someone whose embroidery had appeared in the garden with fresh blood on it, and a pattern that matched Serafina's own wedding veil. Serafina went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, with the concentrated focus of someone who understands that what they are dealing with is larger than they initially assessed. The late Duchess, the delicate Elena, died of fever, the room sealed as a shrine. She thought about the pale shape in the window. She thought about what Morgana had said. She was not suited to the demands of Blackwood. She began to understand what she was living inside. The gaslighting began in the 3rd week. It was subtle at first. The kind of subtle that is only visible in retrospect, which is precisely how it is designed. A conversation at dinner where Morgana mentioned, lightly, to Alistair, that Serafina had seemed confused about the household schedule. She asked the housekeeper about rooms that don't exist, Morgana said, with a small, concerned smile. I think the size of the manor may be overwhelming for her. Serafina had asked about no such rooms. She had asked about the attic. She looked at Alistair. He was looking at his mother with an expression of mild worry. Are you finding it all very much? He asked Serafina. Not at all, she said clearly. I find I'm managing perfectly well. Morgana's smile was patient. Of course you are, dear. The week after, Morgana told Alistair that Serafina had been found crying in the corridor by one of the maids. Serafina had not been crying in any corridor. She had been in the library reading. The maid, when Serafina found her and looked her in the eye and asked her directly, looked at the floor and said she may have been mistaken. In the 4th week, Serafina found that certain objects in her room had been moved, not dramatically, Subtly, the small displacements of things that made you question your own memory. A book on a different side of the nightstand. A brush moved from left to right. Small enough to dismiss. Cumulative enough to be designed. She did not dismiss them. She began replacing everything in her room in positions she noted precisely, so she would know. She also began watching Alistair more carefully. There was something she had noticed, and not yet fully examined. A quality in him that she had initially attributed to his contained manner. A fogginess at certain hours, an occasional blankness that passed through his eyes like cloud across water. It was subtle. It was intermittent. It was always worse in the evenings. She began watching the wine. On a Tuesday evening in the 5th week, she saw it. Dinner had been cleared. The decanter of port sat on the sideboard, where it always sat. She had excused herself early. A headache, she said, which Morgana received with a satisfaction she almost didn't conceal. And she had gone upstairs. She had not gone to bed. She had gone to the gallery that ran above the dining room, where a narrow window allowed a view below. Morgana stood at the sideboard with her back to the dining room door. Her hand moved over the decanter. Something transferred from her closed fist to the port. A powder, colourless, dissolving instantly. The movement was practiced, automatic. The movement of someone who had done this many times. Serafina stood in the gallery and watched Morgana replace the stopper on the decanter and turn back to the table and call for Alistair to come and have his port. And she understood, with a cold and clarifying fury, the full shape of what she was looking at. Morgana was drugging her son. Had been drugging him, she suspected, for years. Perhaps since Eleanor, perhaps before. Keeping him manageable. Keeping him foggy enough to believe what he was told, to see what he was shown, to remain the figurehead of a dukedom that his mother was actually running. Alistair was not a villain. He was a victim who did not know he was a victim. He was a man who had been systematically deceived by the person he trusted most, and who had deceived Serafina in turn. Not maliciously, but because he only knew the version of reality Morgana had built for him. And Serafina, she understood now, was being positioned as the next Elena. The next woman who saw too much, who asked too many questions, who was inconvenient. She was being prepared, the confusion being manufactured, the concerned reports of instability being delivered to Alistair's drugged and receptive mind. The pattern was visible now in its entirety. She went back to her room, and she did not sleep. She sat by the window, and she looked out at the moors, and she thought about Elena in the attic, who had seen all of this years before her, and had not found a way out. She thought about what she was going to do about it. The next morning, she went to Morgana's room, not to confront her. She was not ready for confrontation. She went because Morgana took breakfast in the east parlour from 7:30 to 8:15 precisely. And between 7:30 and 8:15, her rooms were empty. Serafina had timed this. She had timed most things in the manner by now. She did not pick the lock of Morgana's room because it was not locked. Morgana, who controlled everything, apparently did not fear being searched. This told Serafina something useful about Morgana's assessment of the people around her. The room was impeccably ordered. Serafina moved through it quickly, looking for specific things. She found the powder in a small glass vial in a locked jewellery case. The case was locked, which told her Morgana was careful about some things. She did not need the vial itself. She needed to know it was there. She found something else as well. In the bottom drawer of the writing desk, beneath a stack of household accounts, was a folder of documents. She opened it carefully. The top document was a letter, dated 4 years prior, addressed to a private physician in London. She read the first paragraph, and her hands went still. As discussed, The patient shows continued resistance to treatment. She remains lucid, which is the primary difficulty. Her claims about the estate finances are unfortunately coherent and would be damaging if given a public audience. I require a formal certification of mental incapacity that will withstand legal scrutiny. You have been recommended as someone who understands the particular needs of families in my position. Below this, in a different hand, was a reply. She read it. She put everything back exactly as she had found it. She left the room. She went to the library and she sat in the chair by the window, and she breathed steadily until the shaking in her hands stopped. Then she went to find the attic key. She took it that night. Morgana slept heavily. The sleep, Serafina suspected, of someone who had never learned to fear being vulnerable, because she had always been the most dangerous person in any room. She lay on her back, with the key ring on the nightstand beside her, and Serafina stood in the doorway for 60 seconds, listening to the deep, untroubled rhythm of her breathing. And then she moved across the room in the dark with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who had learned in a difficult household to move without being heard. The key ring was large. The attic key was the smallest on it, a slender iron key, distinctive, set apart from the household keys by its age. Serafina worked it free from the ring with patient, minimal movement. The metal shifted once, and she stopped and waited, and Morgana's breathing did not change. She left the room. In the east corridor, at 1 a.m, with the manor dark and silent around her, she walked to the attic door and she put the key in the lock. She had expected a shrine, cold and still and preserved in grief. Or she had expected nothing, a bare room, a dead woman's abandoned belongings, the absence at the center of a story she had been told. She had not expected a lamp. Burning low, on a table beside a narrow cot pushed against the far wall, illuminating a room that was sparse but not empty. A chair, a writing table covered in papers, bookshelves built from salvaged planks, a window with a latch that could be opened from the inside. And in the chair beside the lamp, sitting upright, with the alert stillness of someone who had heard the key in the lock and was waiting to discover what came through the door, was a woman. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, pale from years without proper light, thin in the way of someone who had been given enough to survive, but not enough to flourish. She was not wild-eyed or broken or mad. She was watching Serafina with an expression of cautious, precise assessment that Serafina recognized because she had been making the same expression for 6 weeks. They looked at each other across the attic for a long moment. "You're the new wife," the woman said. Her voice was low and controlled and entirely lucid. "I am," Serafina said. "You're Elena." "I am." Elena looked at the key in Serafina's hand. "How did you get that?" "I took it from her belt while she slept." Something shifted in Elena's expression. A recalibration, similar to what had happened in Morgana's face on the front steps, but in the opposite direction. Not the surprise of someone finding less than expected, but of someone finding more. "Sit down," Elena said, and gestured to the other chair. Serafina sat. "How long have you been here?" Serafina asked. 2 years. Elena's voice was flat and factual. "Since she told Alistair I had died. Since she arranged the fever, the death, the burial of an empty coffin in the family plot." She paused. There was no fever. There was a locked door and a woman who knew too much. "The estate finances," Serafina said. Elena looked at her sharply. "You've been thorough." "I found the letter in her desk, the physician she contacted to certify your incapacity." "She had him certify it regardless." Elena's jaw tightened. "She had a document declaring me mentally unfit to manage my affairs signed by a physician who had never examined me. She used it to have me committed to this room. Alistair was drugged when she told him I had died. He was drugged when they held the funeral. He has been drugged consistently since then. She looked at her hands. He doesn't know I'm alive. I need you to understand that. He is not complicit in this. He is a managed person. She has been managing him since he was a child. I know, Serafina said. I watched her put something in his port last night. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What she found, what I found, that she couldn't allow me to speak about. The Blackwood estate fortune, the foundation of it. There was a family 30 years ago, a family called Vane, who held the neighbouring estate. Morgana arranged their ruin, not by accident and not by fair means. She found a way to destroy them systematically, their credit, their reputation, finally, their legal standing, and she acquired their land and their holdings for a fraction of their value when they had nothing left. Elena met her eyes. There are documents. I found them in the West Wing. That's why it stays locked. The records are still there. I transcribed everything I found before she caught me. I have the copies here. She rose and went to the writing table and opened a locked box beneath it with a key she wore on a cord around her neck. She withdrew a folder of papers and held it out to Serafina. Serafina took it. She opened it and read the first page, then the second. She closed it carefully. The Vane family, she said. Are any of them still alive? One. A son. He's an attorney in Exeter now. He was 12 when his family was destroyed. He's been looking for the evidence for 20 years. Serafina sat with the folder in her lap and the lamp burning low between them and the manor, quiet and vast around them. And she thought about everything she had assembled in 6 weeks. The drugged duke, the controlled household, the manufactured madness, the imprisoned woman, the stolen fortune, and the immaculate villain sleeping heavily 1 floor below with her keyring 2 keys short. There is a masquerade next month, Serafina said. Morgana's annual event. Every significant family in the county. Eleanor looked at her. I know. I can hear the preparations every year from up here. I have an idea, Serafina said. She told her. When she finished, Elena was quiet for a long time. In the lamplight, her expression moved through several things before settling. You've been here 6 weeks, Elena said. Yes. She'll have you in this room within the month if you're not careful. I know. Serafina met her eyes. That's why we have to move before she's ready. Elena looked at her with the careful assessment of a woman who had learned the very hard way what trusting the wrong person cost. Then she nodded. The weeks before the masquerade were the most dangerous of Serafina's life, because they required her to perform a particular role with complete conviction. She had to appear to be what Morgana was building her into: confused, fragile, increasingly unreliable. Not because she was surrendering to it, but because the performance bought her time and kept Morgana from looking too closely at what she was actually doing. This was harder than it sounds. Every instinct she possessed was toward clarity and directness. Performing vagueness while her mind ran with precision required a self-discipline she had not previously tested. She allowed herself to seem confused at dinner. She allowed herself to seem to lose track of conversations. She let Morgana's manufactured reports of her instability go unremarked in a way that she knew Morgana would read as confirmation. She also, quietly and carefully, did 3 other things. She wrote a letter to Thomas Vane, attorney, Exeter. She described what Eleanor had found and what Eleanor had transcribed and where the originals were located. She told him that she would need him at Blackwood Manor on the night of the masquerade, and she told him why. She gave the letter to the stable boy who was sweet on a girl in the village and who had no loyalty to Morgana, and she told him it was a matter of some urgency. She met with Elena every night, entering through the attic in the dark, and together they planned. Elena's mind, sharpened by 2 years of isolation and sustained by the project of documentation, was precise and strategic. She knew the manor's layout intimately from the transcription work she had done before her imprisonment. She knew Morgana's patterns and her vanities and her specific fears. Together, they assembled the night's choreography with the care of women who understood that they would not get a second attempt, and she stopped drinking the wine at dinner. She did this gradually, over 2 weeks, so that no one noticed. A sip, put the glass down, let conversation redirect, repeat. She needed to be entirely clear on the night. She also, once she had confirmed her own clarity, began substituting Alistair's evening port glass. Not with drugged wine, and not by touching the decanter, but by a conversation at dinner in the second week that somehow resulted in Alistair developing a preference for a different vintage. One she had specifically requested from the cellar. The decanter on the sideboard sat untouched. After 3 weeks, she noticed Alistair differently. Without the drug, he was different. Not transformed, but clearer at the edges, more present. He looked at her one evening across the dinner table as if he was actually seeing her, rather than the managed impression of her that had been presented to him, and she met his gaze directly and held it. And for a moment, something real passed between them. Not understanding yet, but the precondition of it. Awareness. Morgana noticed his increasing clarity and moved to address it. She switched back to the original decanter and watched for Alistair to use it. He didn't, having genuinely developed the preference Serafina had arranged. Morgana began adding the powder to the new vintage. Serafina watched this and adjusted accordingly, steering dinner conversation away from the wine and toward water, which she praised effusively as particularly good from the Blackwood well. By the 3rd week before the masquerade, Alistair was substantially clearer than he had been since Serafina arrived, and Morgana was increasingly occupied with managing his sharpening attention and had less to spare for Serafina. This was precisely what Serafina had intended. The masquerade was held on a Friday in October, when the moors were at their most dramatic. Low cloud, a cold air, the grounds lit by torches that threw shifting orange light against the manor's grey stone. Carriages arrived from 6 o'clock. The great hall was transformed, candles everywhere, a musician's gallery above the floor, masks and costumes, and the particular charged energy of a social event where anonymity was both the premise and the danger. Morgana presided over it in black and silver, magnificent and in control, moving through her guests with the ease of someone who had stage-managed this event for 20 years. She looked, Serafina thought, as she watched from the gallery above, like a woman who has never considered that the stage might belong to someone else. Elena was in Serafina's room. Getting her there had required the most careful piece of logistics in the entire plan. On the afternoon of the masquerade, under cover of the household's total occupation with preparations, Serafina had unlocked the attic and led Elena down through the east wing by a route she had mapped across weeks of quiet observation. The servants' stair, the linen corridor, the connecting passage to the east bedroom wing. Elena had moved through the manor she had lived in for 3 years with the slightly dazed quality of someone returning from a long exile. She touched the wall once, briefly, and said nothing. In Serafina's room, they dressed. Morgana had ordered Serafina's masquerade costume, a choice that had irritated Serafina at the time and now struck her as almost poetic. Black silk, floor-length, with a sweeping train, a silver mask in the half-face style, a black veil. It was almost exactly the costume Serafina would have chosen herself and was, as she suspected, meant to frame her as something gothic and slightly dangerous. The unstable young duchess, in her dramatic black, supporting Morgana's narrative of her fragility. There were two of these costumes now. Elena was the same height, similar build. In the low and shifting light of the masquerade, behind the silver masks, in the black veils, they were not distinguishable. They had planned it in exact detail. "Ready?" Serafina asked. Elena looked at herself in the mirror with an expression that contained 2 years of attic and everything before it. "Yes," she said. The single word carried more weight than most sentences. "Remember." "I remember everything." Elena looked at her. "Do you?" "Yes." They looked at each other in the mirror. Two women in identical black. Behind the silver masks, their eyes were different. Serafina's clear and resolved, Elena's older and harder. But the set of their shoulders was the same. The quality of their attention was the same. Women who had survived the same house by different routes and had arrived at the same destination. They went downstairs. Serafina entered the ballroom first, at 9 o'clock, moving through the crowd with the ease she had developed over weeks of forcing herself to perform composure. The guests who knew her greeted her with the particular slightly excessive warmth that people show towards someone they have been told is fragile. She smiled and spoke and moved and kept half her attention on Morgana. Elena went differently. She went through the west corridor first, the west wing. She knew the way. She had lived in this manner before the attic. She opened the door that was always locked, and she went inside, and she found what she had transcribed years ago, the original documents, still where they had been when Morgana locked the wing after Elena's imprisonment. She took them. She put them inside her costume. She returned to the masquerade through the east corridor, and she found her first position. The first appearance happened at 9:30. Morgana was in conversation with Sir William Carew, the county magistrate, in the east corridor near the portrait gallery. The portrait gallery, which Serafina had identified weeks ago, contained a portrait of the late Duchess Eleanor, painted in the first year of her marriage, before the attic. A good likeness. Serafina had studied it carefully. Elena stepped into the corridor at the far end from a shadow into the orange torchlight, if for 4 seconds. Then she was gone. Morgana stopped speaking mid-sentence. Sir William looked up. "Lady Morgana, is everything— Did you see—" Morgana's voice was precise and controlled, and contained something beneath the control that was not. "Nothing. Forgive me. Continue." She looked at the empty corridor for 1 additional second. Then she turned back to Sir William. Her hands, Serafina noted from the gallery above, were not entirely steady. The second appearance was 20 minutes later, in the upper gallery overlooking the ballroom. Elena stood at the balustrade in the black silk and the silver mask, and looked directly down at the ballroom floor for 10 seconds. Several guests looked up. One woman in the crowd said, "Who is that?" And her companion said, "I don't know." And Morgana, below, looked up, and her face did something complicated. The third appearance was the most deliberate. Serafina had arranged this one specifically. Elena found Morgana in the music room at 10 o'clock, where Morgana had retreated, needing, it appeared, a moment away from the crowd. Elena stood in the doorway of the music room and said, quietly and clearly, "The Vane family." Morgana turned. The corridor behind Elena was dark. The torchlight made shapes uncertain. What Morgana saw, what she allowed herself to see, was a woman in black with a silver mask and a voice she would know anywhere. "You are dead," Morgana said. Her voice was extraordinary, controlled, still, but under the control something was fracturing. "You died 2 years ago." "Did I?" Elena said. Not a question. Then she turned and walked away into the dark corridor and was gone. Morgana returned to the ballroom at 10:15 with composure that was technically intact and fundamentally altered. Serafina watched her move through the crowd and recognized the specific quality of a person whose internal architecture is sustaining damage while the external presentation holds. Morgana was frightened. She was controlling the fear with the expertise of a lifetime's practice, but it was there. She looked, as she moved through the room, for the black silk figures. She found one, Serafina, identifiable to her by a dozen small things she had spent weeks cataloguing. She watched Serafina, and watching Serafina confirmed her sense of reality. The ghost was a hallucination or a trick, and here was the true Duchess, present and accounted for. Then she looked up at the musicians' gallery and saw the other one. Both of them, at the same time. Morgana stood very still in the middle of the ballroom and looked from one black figure to the other, and her face went through several things very quickly. Serafina chose this moment. She raised her voice above the music and the conversation, not loudly, but with the particular carrying quality of a woman who has decided that being heard is no longer optional. And she said, "I have something to say to this room." The music faltered. Conversations stopped. The nature of the moment communicated itself to the crowd, the way such moments always do, through some animal awareness that something unprecedented is happening. "My name is Serafina Blackwood," she said. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and I would like to introduce you to someone you were told was dead." She looked up at the gallery and nodded. Elena came down the stairs. She removed her mask at the bottom of the stairs, in full sight of the assembled guests, and she stood in the torchlight with 2 years of attic and everything before it in her face. And she was entirely, unmistakably, solidly alive. The ballroom did not make noise immediately. It went through a moment of pure collective incomprehension, the silence of a room full of people whose framework for the event has been suddenly and irreparably broken. Then it found its voice. Sir William Carew, who was a practical man and a good magistrate, moved through the crowd before it became chaos. He had been reached by Serafina's letter 2 weeks prior. Not the letter to Thomas Vane, a different letter. A careful and specific letter that had told him enough to make him come to the masquerade with 2 constables discreetly positioned by the gates. He had come, Serafina thought, because something in her letter had the quality of documented truth rather than hysterical accusation. She had been careful about that. He came to stand beside Serafina, and he looked at Elena, and he looked at Morgana, who had not moved from the centre of the ballroom. "Lady Morgana," he said. Morgana looked at Elena. She looked at her for a long time with the expression of someone watching the structure of a carefully built thing collapse. "She was unstable," Morgana said. Her voice was still controlled. "She was dangerous. The things she claimed about the estate were delusion. I was protecting the documents," Elena said. She reached inside her costume and withdrew the folder. She held it out to Carew. "These are the original records of the transactions regarding the Vane estate, 30 years ago. I have copies in a location outside this manor. Thomas Vane, who is also present tonight." She looked toward the doors, where a man in a plain mask had been standing quietly for the past hour, "has been corresponding with me for 2 years through a method Lady Morgana was not aware of." She looked at Morgana. "The stable boy," she said quietly. "You overlooked him." Morgana looked at Serafina. Something moved through her expression. Not regret, not guilt, but the particular fury of a person who has lost because they underestimated. "You have been here 6 weeks," Morgana said. "Yes," Serafina said. "You were supposed to become the next ghost?" Serafina said, gently, almost kindly. No. Carew took the documents from Elena. He looked at Morgana with the expression of a man who has just been handed a considerably larger evening than he had expected. "Lady Morgana Blackwood," he said, "I am going to need you to accompany me." Morgana did not move immediately. She stood in the centre of the ballroom, surrounded by the people she had managed for 20 years, and she looked at the two women in black, one who had endured her and survived, one who had seen through her in 6 weeks, and her face did one last thing that Serafina would remember. It didn't break. She was too controlled for breaking, but something behind it went out, like a lamp when the oil is gone. The authority that had animated it for 60 years, so built on crimes and concealment and the systematic silencing of inconvenient women, simply ceased to have a structure to inhabit. She walked out of the ballroom between Carew's constables with her back straight and her head up, and she did not look behind her. Alistair found Serafina in the garden an hour later. The guests had gone, some immediately, most after the particular extended murmuring of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for years and are not yet ready to stop. The torches were burning low. The moors beyond the garden wall were dark and still. He had found Elena first. Serafina had arranged that. She had told the housekeeper to ensure Alistair spoke to Elena before he spoke to her, because what he needed to understand first was not anything Serafina could give him. He needed to see his first wife alive and hear from her directly, and he needed to go through whatever that required without Serafina in the room. He looked, when he came out into the garden, like a man who has just had the architecture of his life reconstructed around him. His face was pale and still, and carrying something enormous very carefully. "She's alive," he said. "Yes. For 2 years." He stopped. "I buried her. I stood at a grave." "I know." Serafina's voice was quiet. "I'm sorry." He was silent for a long time. The cold air moved across the moors, and the last torch by the garden wall guttered and caught. "My mother?" he said, and the 2 words contained something so large he didn't follow them with anything else. "Yes." "How long did you know?" "I suspected from the 3rd week. I found the documents in her room in the 5th. I met Elena in the 6th. She looked at him. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how much of your perception was influenced. I needed time to be certain before I acted." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. The specific process of a man who is learning that his reality has been managed for years and is now attempting to establish what is real without the framework that has been scaffolding his understanding. It was not a quick process. It would not be a quick process. She did not try to rush it. "The wine," he said slowly. "Yes. I thought I was simply tired. I thought—" He stopped. "How long has she been doing it?" "Elena would know better than I would." She paused. "Years, I think. Since before Elena." He looked at the manor, at the lit windows of the great hall, where the housekeeper was directing the dismantling of the masquerade, at the dark windows of the west wing, unlocked now for the first time in years. "What do I do?" he said, and it was not quite a question. It was a man with no remaining architecture reaching toward the possibility of a new one. "Tonight, nothing," Serafina said. "Tonight, you speak to Elena. You give her what she needs to rest in a proper room and not a locked attic. Tomorrow, Carew will come back, and there will be legal proceedings, and those will take time. But tonight, you speak to Eleanor, and you begin to understand what you have been living in." He looked at her. "And you?" She met his eyes. The honest, clear, uncalculating gaze of a woman who has no interest in performing anything for anyone anymore. "I am going to be very honest with you," she said. I came here because I needed to escape a situation I could not otherwise leave. I married a man I did not know because the alternative was worse. I intended to be a good duchess and a good wife, and to make the best of what I had chosen. She paused. I don't know who you are yet. The man I have been married to for 2 months was a man being chemically managed by his mother. I have no idea who you are without that. Neither do you. She looked at him steadily. So, I don't know what happens with us. What I know is that I am not leaving until Elena is free and legally protected and has her portion of the estate settled properly. And after that, I don't know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. I suspect it might be, she said. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people in the same moment of uncertainty, which is at least a shared place to be. Thank you, he said, for what you did tonight. For Elena. For... He stopped. For looking, she said. Someone should have looked sooner. The weeks that followed were exactly as complicated as Serafina had known they would be, and she moved through them with the steady attention of a woman who has discovered that she is considerably more capable than any situation has previously required of her. The legal proceedings against Morgana were substantial. Thomas Vane, who had spent 20 years building his case from the outside and now had the original documents and Elena's testimony and the full weight of Carewe's involvement, pursued it with the methodical fury of a man who has waited a long time. The Blackwood Estate's acquisition of the Vane lands was investigated, documented, and in the end, partially reversed. The current Vane heirs received restitution, a settlement negotiated over months that was not everything, but was something, which is sometimes the nature of justice when the original wrong is 30 years old. Morgana was tried. She was convicted on 3 counts: the unlawful imprisonment of Elena, the falsification of Elena's death, and the fraud relating to the Vane estate. She went to it with her spine straight and her head high and her face entirely controlled, which impressed some people and did not impress Serafina at all. Elena's legal standing was restored. Her marriage to Alistair, never legally dissolved because she had never legally died, required its own complicated set of proceedings. She chose annulment, which was granted on grounds of the fraud perpetrated against both parties. She received her portion of the estate, legally and completely, and she left Blackwood Manor on a day in January with a trunk that was not borrowed and a destination she had chosen herself. Before she left, she and Serafina stood in the garden by the south wall, where the rose thorns had caught the embroidery in October. The pattern, Serafina said. Your wedding veil and mine. How did that happen? Elena smiled, and it was the first full smile Serafina had seen from her. Morgana ordered the same pattern for both weddings. She had very specific ideas about what a Blackwood duchess should look like. She didn't consider that the veil would outlast her plan. She looked at the rose thorns. I sent it down tied to a thread, hoping someone would find it. I had tried before, and nothing came of it. I didn't know if anything would come of it this time. It came of it, Serafina said. Yes. Elena looked at her. What will you do? Serafina considered the question seriously. Around them, the January garden was bare and cold and completely, starkly honest. No performance of beauty, just the structural truth of things waiting for spring. I don't know yet, she said. I find I'm interested in that, the not knowing. I have spent my life either trapped by a situation or planning my way out of one. I have not previously had the experience of simply having options. She paused. I might stay for a while. I might not. I'm going to find out who Alistair is when no one is managing him, and what I think of that person, and what he thinks of me, and we'll see. And if it's not what you want, then I'll leave, Serafina said simply. I have resources now. Elena, I negotiated a formal settlement from the estate as a condition of assisting in the proceedings. Not because I need it, and not because I'm mercenary, but because I have learned that resources are the difference between a woman who has options and a woman who doesn't. I have options. Elena nodded. The nod of a woman who understands this in a way that is not theoretical. They embraced, briefly and firmly, like the embrace of people who have shared something too complicated for ordinary friendship, and have come out the other side with something that is its own category. Elena's carriage came at noon. Serafina watched it go down the drive and turn onto the moorland road and become small against the grey January sky. She stood at the gates of Blackwood Manor, and she looked at the house. At the west wing windows, unshuttered now, letting in winter light. At the attic window, where a lamp had burned for 2 years and now burned no more. At the front steps where Morgana had stood in black and silver and assessed her and found her manageable. She was not managed. She had not been managed. She had come here with a single trunk and a borrowed veil, and she was still here. And the woman who had built this place into a trap was gone. And the woman who had been trapped in it was free. And Serafina herself was standing at the gates in January with resources and options and the clear-eyed understanding of her own capabilities that only comes from having used them at full stretch. She looked at the manor for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back up the drive, through the front door that stood open, into the house that was, for now, on her terms, by her choice, hers. She had come looking for a saviour. She left that idea at the gate. She carried something better. If this story stayed with you, I want to know which moment got you first. Was it the embroidery on the rose thorns, the moment Serafina watched Morgana at the decanter, or the second when Elena walked down those stairs and removed her mask? Drop it in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next story is already waiting, and it starts in a room that was supposed to be empty.